Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our February edition of Ask the Expert webinar series. Tonight is a very much anticipated topic, decoding the newly released federal dietary guidelines. We are honored today to have Dr. Lawrence Appel with us, a distinguished expert whose work has been instrumental in shaping dietary practices across the nation. Currently, Dr. Appel serves as the director of Welch Center for Prevention, Epidemiology, and Clinical Research at Johns Hopkins. His leadership at this interdisciplinary research unit bridges the schools of medicine and public health with a mission to conduct top-tier research and train the next generation of clinical, epidemiologic, and translational researchers. Dr. Appel's research has been groundbreaking, particularly in the realm of preventing blood pressure-related cardiovascular and kidney diseases. His current active lines of research include controlled feeding studies, behavioral intervention trials exploring novel lifestyle changes, and cohort studies related to chronic kidney disease. He has also played a vital role in an evidence synthesis and policymaking to advocate for lifestyle modifications as a strategy to prevent and manage cardiovascular renal diseases. One of Dr. Appel's most notable achievements is leading the research that resulted in the DASH diet, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, promoted by the National Institutions of Health. This dietary pattern has become a cornerstone for health-conscious individuals aiming to maintain optimal blood pressure and overall health. Beyond his research, Dr. Appel has passionately mentored numerous students, fellows, and junior faculty, sharing his wealth of knowledge and nurturing the next wave of experts in the field. His dedication to mentorship underscores his commitment to the future of public health and clinical research. Join us as we embark on an enlightening conversation with Dr. Appel, where he will unravel the complexities of the newly released federal dietary guidelines. If you have any questions anytime during the session, please use the Q&A feature, and we will get to those questions as we're going through. Dr. Appel, thank you so much for your time and spending it with us this evening. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself that I didn't already mention, and what any of your experience in nutrition and dietary guidelines?
Oh yeah, sure. So it's a pleasure being here. I'm happy to help decode the guidelines. Just one minor correction. I was Wealth Center director. I stepped down, that's fine. I can do other things. So I'm a physician by training. Actually an internist. So I have treated many patients with chronic diet-related conditions like high blood pressure. I'm also a parent and now a grandparent too. And I must say that, my interest in diet and lifestyle modification, I think are really relevant, not just for myself and adults like myself, but I think for families. I think one of the messages that I'll start with and I'll end with is that the chronic conditions we're concerned about that occur later in life, like cardiovascular disease, cancer, osteoporosis, they start really early in life. It's not something that just happens when people are in their 40s or 50s. So establishing early habits, I think, is really quite useful, and something that I tell people that if I were to start my career again, I would really focus on children, because I think that's where the action is in terms of prevention. So, yeah. So as you pointed out, is it Alicia?
Jalicia.
What's that?
Jalicia.
Jalicia. Okay. Yeah, I started not as a person focused on nutrition. My focus has been in preventing and controlling high blood pressure and its complications. And those complications are heart disease, stroke, and kidney disease. And so I started off by doing, studies like feeding studies, and then those are very controlled settings where we feed people, give people food to eat of a particular type, and you test their effect. Do behavioral interventions, which test in free living people, selecting their own food, deciding on whether they're going to exercise or not. Those are more challenging studies because they're not as controlled. But that's what I've spent most of my time on. And because of, some of my success, like the DASH study, I've been invited to serve on policy committees. It's not as though I was interested in policy. I never even thought I would be doing it, but that has been something that has been really quite positive, and I'm glad to to share my experience. Um, so it turns out that after finishing the DASH study and another study on sodium, I was invited to lead a panel, National Academy of Medicine, on setting dietary reference intakes, that how much to eat or not eat of sodium, potassium, and water. And then as a result of that, I was invited to serve on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Committee in 2005. And because I'm a masochist, I agreed to do it again in 2010. Um, and through that, I've been, become very familiar with this process of the way dietary guidelines are established. And the last set of guidelines, the ones that were released last month, deviated from that process, and I'll tell you how. Uh,
Yeah.
the
How
yeah.
how are the guidelines even like how is that process even happening? Like how do they decide what becomes a guideline?
Okay, so so the dietary guidelines are mandated activity by Congress that occurs every 5 years. Okay, so and it's on these anniversaries like 2005, 10, 15, 20 or so. And this one was started and was supposed to be released in 2025. Um, so the first step in the process is to assemble a committee, a scientific advisory committee um, that covers the spectrum of diet-related diseases and conditions. So it's a combination of people like myself who are, nutrition oriented, but physicians, but also card carrying dietitians, nutrition scientists, and it's a group of people who tend to be close to the top of their field or at the top of their field. They're vetted and they meet very frequently for about 1 year. It's a voluntary task. I was not paid to do it. It took a lot of time. I
Sounds
can
like
tell
it.
you. Yeah. And one of the things we did is we as a committee decided what were the important questions that needed to be answered, and then we reviewed the evidence on those questions and made a recommendation for the guidelines. I didn't set the guidelines. We made recommendations about what should be covered in the guidelines. Okay, so our step was the first step. Group of experts that review the literature on important issues. We had something like 40 questions in 2005, and then closer to 100 in 2010. And then as a result of that, there's a very thick book, and I brought it. I showed it with you. It's like a I know there are no telephone books, but this looks like a
But I
telephone book
remember
for
a
the
telephone book.
book. Yeah. So it looks like this is what the 2005. I mean, it was a document that covered a huge amount of information. From that document, a group of scientists across the federal government who are, again, focused on nutrition, they take that document and then they craft it into dietary guidance, which is that in itself is a process. And I'm not as familiar with that because I wasn't involved. My job ended as soon as that report was finished.
Okay.
Okay. And then a set of guidelines comes out. It's typically written in a way that is, easily understood, like eat more fruits and vegetables, something like that.
Hmm.
And they, and the wording can be very precise, on that point. Okay. Now, this is a really important aspect of it. These are guidelines on recommendations for what people should eat. The implementation of that, though, is not part of, that process. So this says eat this, not that, okay for this. Okay. But in terms of making policy that actually helps people do that, like says, if you cannot if you're going to serve soda, you can't serve more than 16 ounces or something like that.
Okay.
Those kind of none of that. So the guidelines we have, I actually thought were really good, and they've gotten better over time in terms. But there's been concern that people say, well, we're getting more chronic disease, and they're saying, well, the guidelines are wrong. It's not that the guidelines are wrong. It's just that they weren't implemented. The changes that were required to the environment that should be done because it's not individuals. I mean, individuals can select foods, but quite frankly, we all know that when we go to a supermarket, there is this, these quarters, of gallons of soda,
Right.
energy drinks, there's ultra
The
processed
big
foods and
cups at
snacks,
the big cups of drinks at fast food places.
right, right, and fast food places, and in attempts to improve the environment were fought vigorously by industry. So it's not that the guidelines were wrong, it's just that they really weren't implemented. It was so.
So if
Anyways,
those
I just
guidelines weren't wrong, what changed? Like, why did they need to change so drastically for this newly released guideline?
because these, I think, quite frankly, there's and I don't want to go spend too much time on it. I think there's a political aspect to this, and then the current, I think the HHS secretary became the HHS secretary because he brought he brought
Yeah,
a coalition of voters, that were
understood.
interested in that to the table. But and he has his own views of nutrition, and they deviate from established evidence. And he was, I think, steering the he didn't like the report of the Scientific Advisory Committee in 2025. So they basically ignored about half the recommendations in that. And then and I'm not even sure because the process they followed is not clearly articulated in any document. So they have some people that wrote their own that wrote a report, and then there's some people that actually made the recommendations, but this whole process is not at all clear if you read the documents. I read key sections, and so it's not as, but again, there are certain things that, I mean, the secretary believes that beef tallow is a healthy fat, that butter is a healthy fat, and there's absolutely no evidence that that is the case. Okay.
So are those some of
So
the key changes that we've seen from the previous guidelines?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the description of fats and what is considered healthy is different. Um, uh, I forgot one thing at the very beginning that besides the serving on U.S. Dietary Guidelines Committee, I've served on the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association for now 30 years. Okay. And I was involved with, they prepare their own set of guidelines for heart disease prevention. And those guidelines, I think, are actually really quite strong. And as I, sent to you, they're
Mhm.
hopefully you can distribute. They're understandable, and I think they're the best science. And they might not have as much impact as the U.S. dietary guidelines, but a lot of people view them as very authoritative because they're evidence-based by recognized people that are, appropriate to make recommendations. So, okay. So anyways, that probably is too much about me and what I've done. And I know I've drifted into the questions, but
It's
um,
okay. So
yeah.
while we're talking about, we were talking about the guidelines and that process. So could you give us a brief overview of what the newly revised guidelines are?
Okay. So the guidelines, um, in some respects, you know, reiterate what we have said before. Okay, they do say eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Okay, and that's
Okay.
good. Okay, they say whole grains instead of refined grains. That's good. And they said reduce sodium and salt intake. Well, that's good. And that's the same thing with sugar sweetened beverages and added sugar. That's good. We've said this for a long time. That's okay. But the things that are different, and that are and that are and this emphasis on changing the idea of what healthy fats are. They give lip service and said keep saturated fat below 10%. But at the same time, they say eat full fat dairy, eat eat plenty of meat. In fact, they recommend, meat at every meal, which is protein at every meal. And that's really a big change. In fact, U.S. dietary guidelines typically don't do what they said, which is eat 50% more protein. That's what's recommended. Usually that's set by another group, and then it's just operationalizing that recommendation. But to say we need 50% more protein is not grounded in science. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. And a byproduct of that is that it will lead to higher saturated fat intake. Okay. When I think of fats, there are two types of fats, healthy fat and unhealthy fat. Keep it in easy buckets. The
Hmm.
healthy fats are liquid oils that are like monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, canola, soybean oil. Those are actually healthy fats, even though some people have said that seed oils are harmful. That's not the case. The best available evidence is that they're beneficial.
Okay.
Monounsaturated fat, which is like what's in olive oil, is also considered a healthier fat. The fats that are harmful are the saturated fat and trans fats. Okay. And we're surprised as scientists focused on cardiovascular disease that saturated fats are now being considered really, healthy fat, the way they've been treated. In
And
fact,
what's an
this
example of a saturated fat?
okay, saturated fats are actually like solid fats. They're like if you got a piece of, let's say you got a steak or something like that, or you get hamburger that says like 80%,
Yeah. Hmm.
that other 20% is like a solid fat. And those are the fats that have been associated with heart disease, not in just observational studies, but in clinical trials where they actually replaced, higher saturated fat. They tested higher saturated fat diet versus lower saturated fat diets and replacing that saturated fat with like oils, liquid fats, okay? Um, and reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. And over time, there have actually been, really large reductions in coronary heart disease, heart attacks, and and part of that we believe is due to, these changes in dietary intake that have occurred over decades. So we don't want to change, turn the corner on that
Right.
by suddenly saying, eat more saturated fat, or they don't really directly say it, but what they do say is eat more protein. But because of the way they phrase the protein recommendation, that will inevitably lead to higher saturated fat. Okay.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is a tricky part, is that, and one that I think resonates but is complex to implement. They say, you know, don't eat ultra processed foods. Okay. And, it sounds good. And I quite frankly generally believe it. But when on serving on committees that try to make guidelines, it's a very poorly defined concept that is almost impossible to implement right now because it is not, you'd like to say, you know, being very direct, like, and you think that ultra processed food is everything is unhealthy, but that's not the case. There are healthy ultra processed foods. Milk that is pasteurized is a processed food. Okay,
Hmm.
so I'm not I'm an internist. I'm not a nutritionist, but they're in the field among experts. They go like, wait a second, we agreed to eat mostly unprocessed food, but the problem is we don't have a nomenclature, we don't have a classification system that allows like industry or cafeterias and schools to say this is ultra processed food and it's not that. What you can say is something like this. You can say, do not drink sugar sweetened beverages, or if you do, limit it. That's a very concrete,
Yes.
statement.
Clear,
Or you could
easy to understand kind of direction.
very easy to understand. So another one would be processed meats. Okay, so like sausage, or when I was a kid growing up, it was Slim Jims. I don't know if you remember. I don't know,
Yes, I
but those
do.
are the kind of. Okay, I confess I had a few Slim Jims in my life, but not recently, not recently. So those are kind of like concrete kind of guidance that you give to people. Ultra processed food sounds good, but it's impossible.
Yeah.
So that was one of the recommendations. And so it is something that I sort of agree with, but I just don't know how they can implement it. And it's bedeviled us for years, okay? And I sort of doubt that it's going to be resolved. Um, Another major sort of change was dairy, where they said that full fat dairy is okay. And this is one where there's bodies of evidence, um, and it's not clear. One thing we can say is there's no evidence that full fat dairy is better than low fat dairy. And to date, we have been focused on low fat dairy, and and I don't think it's wise to change policy to say full fat is okay when we still are having lots of coronary heart disease. We still have children in which you're trying to prevent the early manifestations or
Right.
causes of heart disease. And so the risk is, consuming full fat dairy over a lifetime, could and I think will increase the risk of heart disease. Now, so my own sense, and is somebody who's been involved with policy making recommendations, is that yes, you make a change. You don't make changes on drastic changes unless you have firm evidence like of a benefit or firm evidence of harm. In this case, it was sort of like I'm not quite sure the evidence base doesn't really you know uh, differ between those two. So I think that that's a mistake. Um, and then the last thing is some of the healthy dietary patterns that have been recommended, such as the DASH style diet or a Mediterranean style, which actually for the most part are similar. They're not even mentioned, because
Wow.
yeah, and yeah, so those are some of the major sort of concerns we have. Um, and yeah,
So
so
as a consumer with those changes, especially with the kind of no mention of healthier options like the Mediterranean style diet or the DASH diet, if will following these guidelines make me healthier or harm me?
um, I don't think they're going to make you healthier. I think there's a distinct possibility that they will harm you if they are sustained. And I would know this was going to come up in a later, the big question is, will they be sustained? Because I think, quite frankly, they deviate so much from what is known as healthy that I think that if there's a change in administration, they'll likely go back to, which is not good. You don't
No,
really
that's
want to.
confusing. That is a
That's
confusing
confusing,
process.
yeah. So I do, one of the things that happens with dietary guidelines is that it is sort of like focuses on the individual and saying individuals should do this, individuals should have. Education is useful,
Hmm.
but the real action, if you're going to change dietary habits in a whole population, are making, you know, environmental changes that lead to and policy changes that change it. Okay. It's
That kind
hard
of
to
force us
change
to
the
make the decision.
diets. It's hard to change the diets of 330 million people, just by saying eat this and not that.
Right.
Doesn't work that way.
And I can imagine that, hearing different advice from, like, you mentioned how the American Heart Association kind of gives a little bit of a different guideline, or compared to this new dietary guideline, and that can cause a lot of confusion for somebody who wants to make the right decision but is
Yeah, yeah.
unaware of how to approach. And then we have all this information out there, you don't know what to do. So with that being said, speaking of me, who the target audience, like the guidelines are primarily aimed at who?
Now, originally, this is a great question. So, originally, they were supposed to be, we'll call it the healthy population, but because and that I think was the population when I was on the committee in 2005 and maybe 2010. But the reality is, our population is overweight, obese, with high prevalence of hypertension, cardiovascular risk factors in these conditions. So they now have expanded it to, say, for other conditions. But so I think that's appropriate in many ways. But that actually started occurring anyways. That's not new to the 2025 guidelines. But the guidelines are for children, adults, pregnant women, lactating women, older individuals, and there are certain caveats for people with chronic diseases. So there's some lip service to, if you have certain chronic diseases, consult with your doctor or something like that.
It
But
seems like the guidelines should be geared towards industry, rather than
well,
so
there's
much towards people.
well, in some ways, the way they were um, released gives you a sense that industry had more than a little impact. Okay, and so let me just give you an example. You know, one of the first things you hear about when you open up their infomercial is finally it's the end of the war on protein. Okay. And what they did, that basically is to, it has, is, makes the meat industry happy and also the dairy industry happy. Okay. And what's interesting about it is there's never been a war on protein. Okay. There is, we basically, what we've said is, first of all, when it comes to protein, and it's not one of those nutrients that is underconsumed. Okay, we didn't need to recommend 50% increase in protein, and when you read the guidelines, it's not a it's not a major part of the recommendation in terms of the amount. What the um, major recommendation related to protein has been is the type, your sources of protein. Okay.
Right.
And the healthiest sources of protein are those, and there's evidence that it's plant-based protein, okay, that are the healthiest sources. And those are like beans, legumes, lentils, that kind of thing. So that's like the first, but if you're going to eat sort of, I'll call it meat-based, seafood it would be a choice, okay? If you're
Mediterranean
going,
diet, basically.
yeah, or dash too,
Dash,
it's
yeah.
not okay,
Pescatarian
but
diet, yeah.
okay. And then yeah, if you're going to eat meat, we say lean versions, and if you're going to consume dairy, it's low-fat dairy. So, and the reason that we do that, it's not as much the protein, but what comes with the protein. Okay, and that's you know no virtually no fat with plant-based, healthier fats with seafood, and then more harmful, the unhealthy fats with meats. Okay.
So what should we do? Like, is there still any benefit? I know, like, if you go to some of the coffee shops, there's always like they got protein coffee now, and protein seems to be popping up in a little bit of everything. Is that something that's still like okay, or should we still be sourcing our protein from plant-based sources, like actual, like beans,
So
things like that?
okay, so here is what I so I think industry needs a gimmick every few years, okay? And the gimmick for several years is avoid gluten, and gluten is definitely can be a problem for people with celiac disease.
Right.
And I have a relative who has celiac disease, and it's challenging, and that's an important issue. But it was geared to like the whole population, like reduce your gluten
Yeah.
intake, and that really wasn't critical, but it became a rallying cry. And I wasn't involved with those kind of, that's not something that I really had ever even focused on. So right now there is I'll call it trend or trendy, um, idea that protein should be increased and you should increase your protein intake, wherever you eat, whether it's a coffee shop and my own thought is, yeah, eat some protein. That's fine. We need protein, but we don't need 50% more protein. And if you do eat protein from sources that are less, that are more healthy and more healthy sources of protein. I mean, I do have meats occasionally, but it's not the most common food that I eat, and I certainly don't eat it on a daily basis, and I certainly don't eat it at every meal.
Interesting. So I have a question in the chat.
Okay.
So for the purpose of, as a community educator, looking for like easy visuals, I'm finding it hard to translate the new food pyramid to a my plate like visual. Is it
That person is spot on. I congratulations whoever asked that. That is I yeah, so several years most people have been familiar with the food pyramid. And the food pyramid was okay, but not great as a visual. Okay. And then I forget what year it was that when the guidelines came out, I think it was 2010, it might be. That's the one that I was last one I was served on. Um, they decided to have a new graphic, and it was my plate. And I thought that was great. That really reflects what people, it visually says, eat this, and it gave more of an impression of foods that should be emphasized, smaller amounts of the plate
Mhm.
devoted to like protein sources, which I mean, most of our calories, by the way, do not come from protein. Only about 15% of our calories. So most of the proteins or most of our calories come from fat and carbohydrate, and that's the other parts of the plate. But I would go to my plate, quite frankly. I still think, although it might not be easy to find, because I think they probably stripped a lot of the older infographics and supporting and material. Um, the current triangle, the upside down triangle,
Mhm.
is uninterpretable from my perspective because people have sort of they've had the idea of a pyramid before. This pyramid, instead of being like this, is like this. And so what does that mean? You know, and then it puts three at each of the points. It goes one is meats, one is fruits and vegetables, and the other is whole grains at the bottom. I don't know what that means, you know.
Right. So she
And,
has a
and
follow-up question. So if the new
okay,
guidelines are are far off the mark, is it ethical to promote them as a community educator?
I would not. I would, what I would, I think I think you have to be careful in saying that there are certain aspects of it that I think we all should agree with, eating more fruits and vegetables. And I personally think you should eat fruits and vegetables at every meal. Forget about the protein that eat every meal. Eat fruits and vegetables. There's only one way that you can really sort of meet some of the recommendations on fruits and vegetables, and that's every meal. If you skip a meal, much less two meals, you're not gonna get five, much less than 10. So I think um, so emphasize some of the things. I don't think anybody, current administration or American Heart Association that is advocating for sugar sweetened beverages, added sugars, that sort of thing. So there are certain things that we can agree on. But I think that I think that you should use some of the material. Quite frankly, I think the American Heart Association their guidelines are so close to what the dietary guidelines would be that I think those are how we should really sort of use as our guidance. And American Heart Association has a lot of um, forward-facing materials for individuals and people like community leaders too.
Good to hear. And so you mentioned the upside down pyramid with an emphasis, like a part of it being whole grains. So one question in the chat says, could you go over the importance of whole grains and the impact
Mm,
of the new guidelines to decrease them? And would you consider there to be a stigma around carbohydrates?
yeah. So, so one thing to think about, we haven't really talked about cost, but cost is obviously a big issue. When it comes to what people purchase. There's taste, there's cost, there's health. Those are maybe the three big issues on what people make decisions on. Um, Carbohydrate is the least expensive, and that I think is probably one reason why so much of what we eat, breads, rices, and products like that are consumed at such high levels. Whole grains are a bit more expensive than refined grains. And I'm not quite sure the reason, but it might be that they're less, uh, they're not as, they're a lower volume item. I can't be sure. But those are the thing about whole grains and also, fruits and vegetables is that they're high in fiber. And I know that this session is geared towards um, either preventing cancer or helping people who have cancer remain healthy after their treatment. Fiber is one of those factors that really seems to be important. Um, so that I think is whole grains is one good source, and many, but not all. Fruits and vegetables also have that, but actually most do. I'm a big kiwi fan. That's a great fiber source. And I like it too. It's not just because it's healthy. Yeah.
So, to go back to some of our questions, are
Yeah.
there any particular tips for individuals and families to incorporate the more healthy dietary guidelines in their eating habits at home? And then what would that look like when eating out?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think this is where, having a skilled dietitian helps. I'm not a skilled dietitian, so I can just give you um, some, some thoughts. Let me just go to it. Um, So, so as I said earlier, I think eating fruits or vegetables at every meal, is one strategy,
Like,
and that's not necessarily obvious, that, I would have cereal, in the morning, but, that by itself is not a fruit or a vegetable. Banana, blueberries, other things, or oranges, at breakfast. Um, there are issues about spoilage of fruits and vegetables, and I know that's a concern. You don't want to buy something and then
yeah.
it goes. But I think one of the things that has been underestimated is the value of frozen products. There was an interesting article in the New York Times about how in France they actually, really focus on frozen fruits and vegetables as a means. And I think there might even be some government subsidies to encourage that because that allows people to eat, and not deal with this spoilage issue if you buy everything fresh. I mean, I personally like fresh vegetables and fruit, but there's a certain reality I mean, I personally, I do shop with my wife, most of the time. We go out once a week
Mhm.
and some things go bad. But the best way to deal with that is to only buy for a few days and just make sure you have enough frozen vegetables and fruit for the rest. Um, I think swaps. So there are unhealthy foods, and then there are healthier foods. Okay, and so. if this requires some sort of culinary aspect, but you can't just say, oh, instead of a steak, I'm going to have some soybeans. That's just it doesn't make sense, you know. You know, it's sort of like, yeah, you know, you could have chili, vegetable, I mean, you know, vegetarian chili or with beans or salads or stuff like that. I tend to also think minimal meat because that also, I think it's in general healthy, but it's also less expensive because meat is very expensive and
It
it's
is.
getting more expensive. I
It
mean,
is.
it is, you know, and you know, it's interesting. Some people say that, you know, inflation is tamed. You know, that's not the case because food is not included in that in the inflation indicator. And anybody I think who has shopped realizes there's it's
No.
bad. So I think there are w ways. I don't think we perfected the means really now to help people swap though, you
Yeah.
know, from one product to another. I'll give you one, you know, if you're concerned about blood pressure, I believe that that's really important. It's the most modifiable risk factor for heart disease, which still is what people with cancer or have cancer
Yes.
will die of or be afflicted with. Um, there are products that, like spaghetti sauce, they are really high in sodium, like 1,200 milligrams per serving. But the range is really quite large, and you could get a product with a quarter of that, you know, 300 milligrams. So you just have to look at the labels. But helping consumers to make those sort of swaps, it's not easy. You just have to manually look at labels, and it would be great if there were, you know, easy ways to for a consumer to select that product rather than the one that is 1,200 milligrams, for example.
I agree. Because I don't think people fully understand the process of looking at a label and being able to make a decision. You kind of look at a brand and, well, this is the brand we've always used, and continue on with that path without kind of thinking about the nutritional implications that of what you're purchasing. Um,
Right.
the chat is going crazy. I have one question when it comes to protein. It says, are there any guidelines regarding protein powder consumption? Should there be any concerns, I guess?
Um, I don't think so. One thorough thing that I think it might be very relevant to the to individuals in Baltimore, and I know that there are a lot of individuals who have people with kidney disease in their family. Okay, um, protein at high levels is detrimental, and certain kinds of protein, especially acid producing proteins, are thought to be a big concern in people with kidney disease. Um, and so it's one, I mean, it's not really even mentioned in these guidelines that, but I, it's not even, I actually think that that's a big deal, bigger deal than, so I personally I'm not advocating for, you know, protein supplements. As I said, I don't think we've had a protein problem. You know, we're not anti-protein as people are, do need some, but I don't think you need supplemental protein. I just don't think so.
Understood. And then one more question about food. It says, can you comment about margarine or artificial butter being healthier than real butter? I thought that real butter is better in limited amount.
Yeah, yeah. You know, this is a debate that has gone on. And but there now have been studies where, you know, where they've reviewed health outcomes in people who consume mostly butter instead of the margarines. And
Hmm.
when you look at outcomes like, you know, heart attacks or stroke, that those we call them polyunsaturated fats. Those are the ones in the margarine. It turns out they're beneficial, not harmful, you know. And so, you know, this has been a distortion that has occurred, and you're not going to find the American Heart Association promoting butter. I mean, I use butter every once in a while, you know, sometime, but a lot of the times you can just replace it with like, you know, canola or, you know, other vegetable oils, and it is healthier than butter. Um, Dairy industry is not going to be happy with me for saying that, but
And so, like, we are like 15 minutes left, and I want to ask this really important question for our audience about cancer-causing foods. So, the new guidelines have classified certain foods as potentially cancer-causing. Could you elaborate on which foods have been identified and the evidence supporting this classification?
yeah, sure. So, um, so when it comes to some of this is really not new. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I'll just repeat, it's always good to repeat something that's important. So, fiber is increased fiber intake is most likely one of the major causes of colon and GI cancers. Okay. So,
Okay.
consuming more of that is is one of the reasons to eat more fruits and vegetables. Okay, and proteins like uh, beans and lentils and stuff like that. Okay, and so that's I think that's well accepted, and I'm pretty sure that that's not different from what we said in the past. So when it comes to ultra processed food, they mention ultra processed food as a cause of cancer. Um, it's very tricky because these are observational studies, and they we don't really there seems to be some risk, but it's not totally clear that it's other factors besides the ultra processed food, because ultra processed food is could be a marker not just of not just a unhealthy food, but also of an unhealthy lifestyle. Okay, so
Okay.
that's something you really have to think about. Um, some ultra processed foods, I think, have a high probability, okay? Like processed meats that have nitrates and other chemicals that might be associated. And there's pretty good evidence on that too. But again, it's sort of like it's 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 meats that don't have fiber. I mean, one of the things about, about meats in general, with the exception of vegetables, is meats don't have fiber.
Yeah.
And many people probably get constipated in part because of that. But so so I think that's a type of ultra processed food that likely would cause cancer. One other thing that is related to diet, but not really a nutrient component, is that obesity is associated with cancers. Okay, so to the extent that individuals can maintain a lower weight, a desirable weight, or lower their weight from, let's say, obese to overweight or overweight to non-overweight, that's beneficial because several major cancers are associated with obesity. And so I think like breast cancer is one, endometrial cancer is another, and I believe colon cancer is another. You know, so I think those are ways to reduce cancer risks that are diet related. None of these are new that I just
Okay.
mentioned.
So
Okay,
because I
so
know like the one of the big buzzes that has been around on social media since the new year is that now bacon is a level one carcinogen, like right up there with tobacco or like deli meat. And I know I've heard about deli meat, a processed
right.
meat kind of being an issue, but I don't think I've ever heard of it being compared to tobacco when it comes to cancer.
Yeah, I can't say that, it's hard to say that these are equivalent, that because, there's also a dose, people might, know how much bacon, how much tobacco. I mean, I think tobacco is dose relationship starting with nothing and incrementally getting worse. Um, when it comes to bacon, we've always said that, I mean, that's a processed meat. It's high in nitrates and other chemicals that likely are harmful. So, I mean, I haven't, I haven't purchased bacon in years. I don't think it's good for the heart, and I don't think it's good for trying to prevent cancer and its recurrence.
Yeah, I think a lot of times bacon is just overconsumed. People
Yeah,
tend to eat bacon every day, or they eat a large amount of bacon in one sitting. And it,
right.
yeah,
Yeah. One of the things that is sort of interesting and that I haven't really talked about as much as sort of like the environment. When you when people like go to a hotel that serves a free breakfast or breakfast as part of it, it's typically a pretty bad breakfast. It has sausage, it has bacon, and often will have, you know, a few fruit that are hard to find, that kind of thing. And so this gets to an issue that I think is really important. We often eat what's available,
yeah,
and if if the norm are these products like sausage and bacon and high sugar type products, that's what people eat, when they go down to wherever food is served, like at one of these places. But it also applies to other sort of settings as well, church dinners and stuff like that. If people are going to go to, it'd be best if they bring healthier products. So, yeah.
I got a couple of questions in the chat before our final question from us. So, one person said, so is it okay to eliminate carbohydrates from my plate, or is it better to have it at a consistent and regulated amount?
I wouldn't eliminate. I think that it's the type of one of the things about fruit and vegetables. Those are mostly carbohydrate. And so I think that fruits and vegetables are that's the type of carbohydrate to eat. Whole grains are another type of carbohydrate that you can eat. And we're not saying eliminate refined grains, but just reduce. I mean, I'm physically active. I like to walk, run, uh, and I need calories, and those are easy sources of calories. And I'm not going to, eat more meat, and I'm not going to eat, lots of fat. So I think we have to be very pragmatic about this. So fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and some, refined grains would be great.
Hey, and then the next question, it says, could you speak to some of the anecdotal experiences people have shared about keto or carnivore diets or fasting patterns? I know that is another one of those trends that have happened.
Yeah.
The carnivore diet is one that's happened recently that has taken me out. I've heard a lot of people say that this is how they're losing weight. It doesn't sound like
Mm.
that's gearing towards weight loss.
Yeah, well, one of the things that's interesting about diets that are really high in protein, or this diet like the carnivore diet, and they're difficult. People start them, but they don't stick with them. They gravitate back, So we've seen this time and time again. It's just a variant of Atkins diet in some way. I am not a big advocate for those. The keto diet actually is really interesting because there is a very small subset of the population for which it is medically useful, and that's people with seizure disorders. And I don't fully understand why, but that is a definite benefit, and but as a means to, yes, you'll lose weight temporarily, but it'll be regained.
Okay. And I think you made some mention to this. They asked about fasting patterns. And I think you said, like, if we skip meals, we kind of miss our opportunity to get the right amount of fruits and vegetables in our daily diet. So I think fasting
Right.
probably is not really beneficial to our bodies, right?
Well, there's been a lot of sort of interest in what I call timing of meals. And so we did a study where there's time, we call time restricted feedings, where you just eat, between like 8 o'clock and then 5 o'clock. And you don't, and those are periods where you're active and moving and not eating, let's say, like after 6 o'clock where you're watching television or something like that. Um, or watching a video or watching a
Webinar.
symposium like this. You're just sitting. So there are these interests in timing, and fasting, I think, is sort of like a variant to that because they're like, the 5-2, there are these programs where people fast. Again, sustained weight loss, which I think is one of the reasons why people do it, is not really confirmed from what I recall. So, you yeah. Let me just add one thing that I was sort of, thinking about. I know it may not fit in necessarily here, but One of the things that a lot of, what we eat is like these weird habits that we have, and one of them is what I call mindless eating, where there's food almost every place you go, and like at Hopkins, they order food and then it's left over and it's available to eat. You know that 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 leads to overeating, or somebody bringing in, say, candy after Halloween, and then because they have they have leftover candy or something like this.
Because
It's
they don't want to
mindless
get the
eat.
calories at home. They want to share the calories.
They want to get rid of the calories, So I think there's this, it's something that I really believe is that if food is available, if those candies are available, people will eat,
Yeah.
and if it weren't available, you wouldn't even think about it. So
Right.
the extent that we can reduce mindless eating, at home, not having candy in a bowl, maybe at Christmas or something like that for special holidays, but not having it easily available within 2 to 3 feet of yourself.
I
It's
think that's
these
a good habit to
habits.
also teach our children because I know, I have children and, they go to school and it's always some snack, some candy snack that comes home with them. There's always a birthday party. And I think it introduces those kind of habits of mindless eating. You just had lunch. You don't need the candy to graze on, trying to
Yeah,
pick better options to send to our children's school.
no, yep, I agree.
And then I think we touched on this question a little bit about it says it looks like the new guidelines emphasize a high intake of animal-based protein. What harm could it do to our health from this recommendation? So I think you answered that one saying that it leads to an increase of fat intake that's not good for us and could
Yeah,
lead to heart disease. And I know that's constipation, which probably can contribute to
yeah, yeah.
the issues.
Well, well, it's a fiber poor diet. It's a fiber poor. So that is getting to the issue that we're here for is cancer. High protein, is probably going to be associated with a reduced fiber intake. That's why, vegetable protein sources like, beans and lentils and stuff like that is great because it's both protein and fiber. That's a great food. And it's not very well emphasized. It's not even shown on the graphic.
Right.
Um, so yeah, and again, I said earlier, we have an epidemic of chronic kidney disease. I don't think it's a good idea to increase protein intake, especially in the Baltimore community where there are a lot of people who have chronic kidney disease and many who will end up on dialysis. So those are some reasons to avoid, this overemphasis on animal-based protein, which I think has been sort of an industry prompted aspect of these guidelines.
Now, does that concern still affect people who are like bodybuilders or are intentionally trying to get muscles, so therefore they need the extra protein? Is that still a concern of like kidney disease and heart disease?
I'm not as well versed in that topic, but a lot of athletes actually have elevated blood pressure and are at risk for heart disease. So
Wow.
I again, I think I'm not sure that I'll just stop there because I'm not an expert. I don't really want to go into an area that is not, where I'm not comfortable. Okay.
Understood. But I think you did give a little bit of insight, and I appreciate that. So before we sign off tonight, what final piece of advice would you offer to our audience regarding the new dietary guidelines and their personal health journeys?
Okay. I would say well, as for the guidelines, I would say um, stick with, proven evidence that's well accepted by the vast majority of nutrition scientists. So you can take your pick. I would recommend American Heart Association guidelines rather than these guidelines. Um, and I guess I would go back to something I said at the very beginning. If not for yourself, do it for your children, because as I said, chronic disease starts early in life. You won't see it at that point, but you will individuals develop atherosclerosis, high blood pressure, probably other sort of preclinical, tumors and stuff like that, I say just start early and emphasize a healthy diet for your family, not just for yourself.
Great advice and a great way for us to end our evening. Dr. Appel, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to chat with you and for lending your expertise to us. Everyone that's listening, I also, we just dropped a survey in the chat. So if you can access that, just to let us know what you thought about tonight's webinar. And I also will be sending out the resources that Dr. Appel talked about, the American Heart Association's guidelines, along with a little bit of other reading information. And you'll get a recording of this video as well. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to the Kimmel team and we will find out if we can.
Great.
Another one, somebody's
Thank
an
you.
outstanding topic. Thank you, Dr. Appel. We
Okay, you're
appreciate you.
welcome.
Everyone have a good evening. We'll see you next month.